It was a Monday night in December 1989, and somewhere in the English countryside, a man sat alone with a radio scanner, half bored, half curious, testing out a new gadget he'd bought for himself. He had no idea he was about to stumble onto one of the most explosive pieces of audio in the history of the British monarchy. What he picked up that night, purely by accident, would end a royal marriage, humiliate a future king in front of the entire world, and raise questions about surveillance and betrayal that still haven't been fully answered more than 3 decades later. This is the story of the tape that the palace never wanted you to hear. The tape that became known as Camilla Gate, or more bluntly and more famously, Tampon Gate. To understand why 6 minutes of a private phone call could bring a monarchy to its knees, you have to go back further, to a marriage that was already rotting from the inside while the world watched what looked like a fairy tale. Charles, Prince of Wales, and Diana Spenser had married in 1981 in a wedding watched by hundreds of millions of people around the globe. She was 20 years old, he was 32. It was billed as the wedding of the century, a young, shy aristocrat marrying the future King of England, but behind the carriages and the cathedral and the enormous dress, there was a much older story that nobody outside a small circle of friends and family fully understood. Charles had a history with a woman named Camilla Shand, later Camilla Parker Bowles, that stretched back years before he ever met Diana. Charles and Camilla had known each other since the early 1970s. There was an undeniable connection between them from the start, the kind of easy, natural chemistry that some couples spend a lifetime trying to find and never do. But timing was against them. Charles was sent off to serve with the Royal Navy, and while he was away at sea, Camilla married a cavalry officer named Andrew Parker Bowles. It's said that Camilla's own family had long ties to the royal family, going back generations, and that this connection quietly shaped the trajectory of her entire adult life. Years passed. Charles, under enormous pressure from his family and from the institution he was born into, needed a bride. Not just any bride, but one who fit a very specific and very outdated set of expectations. Someone young, aristocratic, and crucially, untouched by scandal. Diana Spenser checked every box the palace was looking for. She came from a titled family. She was barely 20. She appeared, at least on paper, to be exactly what the House of Windsor needed to secure its future. What almost nobody outside the family knew was that Camilla had reportedly given her own approval to the match. She and Charles remained close, and according to numerous royal biographers, their relationship never fully ended, not even after Charles said his vows in front of the Archbishop of Canterbury and a global television audience. The marriage between Charles and Diana looked glamorous from the outside. 2 sons were born, securing the succession for another generation. But inside the walls of Kensington Palace and Highgrove, the relationship was falling apart. Diana would later describe her marriage as desperately unhappy, plagued by loneliness, mental health struggles that the palace refused to properly address, and a growing, painful awareness that her husband's heart belonged to someone else. Charles, for his part, would eventually admit publicly that his relationship with Diana had broken down almost from the very beginning, and that he only returned to Camilla once he believed his marriage was, in his words, irretrievably over. By the late 1980s, whatever the official narrative was, the truth was an open secret among their social circle. Charles and Camilla were seeing each other again, carefully, discreetly, using trusted friends' country homes as meeting points, coordinating schedules around royal engagements, hunting weekends, and Camilla's own marriage. It was in the middle of this secretive, careful arrangement that the events of December 18th, 1989 took place. That night, Camilla was at her own home. Charles was staying at a friend's country estate, and using an early mobile phone, the kind that ran on analog signals easily picked up by anyone with the right equipment, the two of them had a 6-minute conversation that was never meant to be heard by another living soul. The man with the scanner caught every second of it. What he recorded wasn't a discussion of state secrets or royal business. It was something far more intimate, and in some ways far more dangerous to the monarchy, precisely because of how human, how vulnerable, and how unguarded it was. It was 2 people, deeply in love, speaking to each other the way people do when they think absolutely no one is listening. There was longing in it. There was tenderness. There was flirtation. There was a strange, almost boyish sense of humor from a man who would one day be king, joking about wanting to be reincarnated as an item of feminine hygiene, just so he could stay close to the woman he loved. It was silly. It was human. And it was about to become one of the most humiliating public relations disasters in modern royal history. For a while, the tape simply sat there, unheard by anyone except the man who recorded it. This wasn't the first time a royal phone call had ended up in the wrong hands that year. Around the same period, another private phone conversation had been intercepted, this one between Diana and a close friend of hers named James Gilby. That call, too, was intimate, emotionally raw, and clearly never intended for public consumption. It would later become notorious under its own tabloid nickname. And separately, yet another recording surfaced involving Prince Andrew and his then-wife, Sarah Ferguson. 3 different royal phone calls, all somehow captured by outside parties, all surfacing around the same window of time. To many observers, that pattern felt far too coincidental to be an accident. The man who had captured the Charles and Camilla call eventually realized what he was sitting on. After seeing headlines about the leaked Diana tape splashed across the front pages of British newspapers, he understood the tape in his possession could be worth real money. He brought it to a major British tabloid. He was paid a substantial sum for it, and then the editors sat on the recording. Not because they didn't want to publish it, but because the timing wasn't right yet. Charles and Diana were still officially a married couple, still performing the role of a unified royal family for cameras on state visits, even as their relationship crumbled behind closed doors. The tabloid held onto that recording for months. Newspaper editors are patient predators. They understood that a story like this needed the right moment to land with maximum impact, and that moment arrived only weeks after Charles and Diana's separation was formally announced to the British Parliament, live in the House of Commons. It was an unprecedented moment in modern royal history. A sitting government minister confirming to the nation that the heir to the throne and his wife were living apart. The ink was barely dry on that announcement when the tabloids began teasing something even bigger. Headlines began appearing, hinting at a secret bedtime phone call involving the prince. The public didn't yet know the full contents, but the tension built for days. Then, in January of 1993, the full transcript broke, first overseas in an Australian magazine and a German newspaper, and then domestically in major British Sunday papers. Within hours, the nation was consumed by it. What made this scandal different from ordinary tabloid gossip about royal affairs wasn't just that Charles had been unfaithful. That much, by 1993, many people already suspected. What made it different was the sheer intimacy of what had been captured, and the fact that people could hear it themselves. Newspapers didn't just print a summary, they printed the transcript, verbatim, word for word, including a phone number the public could actually call to listen to the recording. Britain, quite literally, could dial in and listen to their future king's most private moment with the woman who wasn't his wife. The content of that 6-minute call became instantly, permanently infamous. In it, the two of them discussed how desperately they missed each other, how difficult it was to be apart, and made plans, in careful, coded language, about which friend's country house might be available for their next secret meeting. And then came the moment that would follow both of them for the rest of their lives, the moment that gave the entire scandal its lasting, almost absurd nickname. In a flight of half-joking romantic exaggeration, Charles told Camilla he wished he could simply live inside her clothing to be closer to her, and when she teased him about what exactly he might turn into, he suggested, laughing, that his luck would be to come back as a certain feminine hygiene product, so he could stay with her permanently. She laughed. He laughed. It was a private joke between two people who loved each other and thought no one else would ever hear it. The entire United Kingdom heard it. Almost overnight, this recording, and the crude nickname it spawned, became a national and then an international punchline. It dominated front pages for days. It was discussed on radio, on television, in pubs, in offices, everywhere. For a man who would one day wear the crown, it was profoundly humiliating. An image of quiet, private affection turned into a national joke almost instantly. The dignity of the institution he represented, reduced to a tabloid headline built around a bathroom product. The fallout was immediate and brutal, and it fell disproportionately on Camilla. Even though Charles was equally present on the recording, equally responsible for the affair, it was Camilla who bore the heaviest public blame for the collapse of the royal marriage. She was cast as the other woman, the homewrecker, the reason the fairy tale had died. Diana, by contrast, was already being cast by much of the press and public as the wronged party, the beautiful, betrayed princess. Camilla's own family reportedly urged her to leave the country entirely for a while, just to escape the intensity of the media siege outside her home. Photographers camped outside her house for days. She was, by multiple accounts, absolutely devastated by the exposure. Inside the palace, the reaction was described as nothing short of seismic. People close to the royal family at the time said that establishment figures who had spent their whole careers being fiercely loyal to the crown were genuinely appalled. There were open, serious conversations happening in private about whether this kind of personal scandal called into question Charles's fitness to eventually become king. That's how damaging this recording was. It wasn't just an embarrassing headline. It was a moment that made people at the very top of British society quietly ask whether the man next in line for the throne could survive this reputationally. And then there was Diana's reaction, which by most accounts was one of genuine shock and disgust, even though by that point she almost certainly already knew about the affair on some level. Her own bodyguard would later write that she was horrified by what she heard, repeating over and over that it was simply sick. Whatever fragile hope remained of the marriage being salvaged evaporated the moment that recording became public property. But the questions this scandal raised went far beyond one embarrassing phone call. Almost immediately, serious people, journalists, politicians, and royal insiders began asking a much darker question. How exactly had this recording been made in the first place? And was it really just an accident? The official explanation, the one that eventually emerged from the man who recorded it, was almost absurdly mundane. He would later claim that he had simply been out one evening, had a few drinks and a meal, and decided to test out a new piece of equipment, an electronic scanner capable of picking up analog mobile phone signals. He said he stumbled onto the call purely by chance, recognized the voice instantly, and kept recording once he realized exactly who he was listening to. Not everyone believed that explanation, not then and not since, because this wasn't an isolated incident. Remember, this was one of at least 3 separate private royal phone calls that had been intercepted and recorded within a relatively short window of time. Diana's own intimate call with a close friend had already leaked. Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson's private conversation had also somehow ended up recorded. 3 different royals, 3 different private moments, all captured by outside parties, all surfacing in the press within roughly the same period. To a lot of observers at the time, that simply didn't add up to coincidence. The editor of one of Britain's most respected newspapers went on record, suggesting that Britain's own intelligence services might have had a hand in it, that the pattern suggested deliberate surveillance of the royal family, rather than a string of unrelated lucky accidents by amateur radio hobbyists. Former intelligence operatives interviewed by international media in the years that followed reportedly said that the sound quality and technical precision of some of these recordings pointed toward professional equipment, not the kind of hobbyist gear the public explanation relied on. The theory that gained traction was that the tapes might have been recorded as part of a broader security or surveillance operation, and that they were then deliberately leaked, whether by rogue individuals within those agencies or through some other channel entirely. To this day, nobody has ever definitively proven who was behind the interception, or why these specific calls, out of what must have been countless private royal phone conversations happening constantly, ended up in the hands of the press at precisely the moments that would cause maximum political and personal damage. The mystery has never fully been resolved. It remains one of the enduring open questions of that entire turbulent decade in royal history. A decade that essentially began the slow unraveling of the image the monarchy had spent generations carefully constructing. What's remarkable, looking back now, is just how long the shadow of that 6-minute phone call has stretched. This wasn't a scandal that faded quietly into the history books the way so many other tabloid stories eventually do. It kept resurfacing, again and again, at moments that must have been deeply uncomfortable for the 2 people at the center of it. Years later, when Netflix's acclaimed royal drama brought the 1990s chapter of the monarchy's history to the screen, the show's creators made the deliberate choice to dramatize the entire scandal in detail, recreating the phone call almost word for word using the actual transcript that had circulated in the press decades earlier. It reignited public fascination with the story for an entirely new generation of viewers who hadn't even been born when the original recording leaked. The show's creator defended the decision publicly, acknowledging that the 1990s had been an extraordinarily difficult period for the royal family, and that Charles himself likely still carried painful memories from that time. The actress who portrayed Camilla in that dramatization later spoke about how deeply she came to sympathize with both Charles and Camilla once she fully understood the context, describing the public exposure of their private conversation as an invasive and frankly disturbing violation, one where ordinary people were suddenly able to call a phone number and listen to 2 people's most intimate moment for entertainment. The scandal resurfaced again, even more unexpectedly, following the death of Queen Elizabeth II. In the wave of renewed global attention on the royal family that followed her passing, old clips and audio snippets of the infamous recording began circulating once again, this time not through tabloid newspapers, but through social media platforms, reaching millions of new viewers, almost instantly. Short clips of the recording, subtitled and remixed, went viral on platforms popular with much younger audiences who had absolutely no context for the story beyond the shock value of hearing a king's private, decades-old voice discussing something so mundane and so strange. Comment sections filled with a mixture of disbelief and dark humor, a whole new generation discovering, for the first time, the strange, human, embarrassing moment that had once threatened to derail an entire monarchy. What's easy to forget, amid all the punchlines and the internet jokes, is what this scandal actually represented at the time it happened. It marked something of a turning point, not just for Charles and Camilla personally, but for the entire relationship between the British monarchy and the modern press. Before Camillagate and its sister scandal involving Diana's own private call, the royal family had, for the most part, still enjoyed a significant degree of genuine privacy, even as public curiosity about their lives grew year after year. After these recordings leaked, that privacy essentially evaporated. The idea that anything a royal said, even in the most intimate, unguarded moments of their personal life, could end up recorded, transcribed, printed verbatim, and broadcast to the entire world, fundamentally changed how the institution operated, and arguably changed the nature of celebrity and public scrutiny more broadly for decades to come. For Camilla specifically, the road back from that scandal was long and difficult. For years afterward, she remained one of the most publicly unpopular figures in Britain, blamed by large segments of the population for the destruction of what had once been presented as a fairy tale marriage. It would take more than a decade of careful, patient publics, rehabilitation, quiet charity work, and a slow, deliberate reintroduction into public royal life before attitudes toward her began to genuinely shift. Charles and Diana's marriage officially ended in divorce in 1996. Diana would tragically die the following year in a car accident in Paris, an event that would reshape the entire monarchy's relationship with the press and the public for a generation. It wasn't until 2005, nearly 16 years after that fateful phone call was recorded, that Charles and Camilla were finally able to marry, in a far quieter, more restrained ceremony than the spectacle that had accompanied his first wedding. And it wasn't until 2022, when Queen Elizabeth II used her own Platinum Jubilee message to formally express her wish that Camilla be known as Queen Consort once Charles ascended to the throne, that the woman at the center of that infamous 1989 phone call received what many considered the ultimate symbol of acceptance from the institution itself. When Charles was finally crowned king in 2023, Camilla was crowned beside him as queen, a moment that would have seemed almost unthinkable to anyone listening to those tabloid phone lines back in January of 1993, when her own family was reportedly encouraging her to leave the country just to escape the public shame. Looking back on the entire saga now, decades removed from the initial scandal, it's hard not to see it as one of the strangest, most human moments in modern royal history. Two people, deeply in love, having an ordinary, silly, tender conversation late at night, the kind of conversation millions of couples around the world have every single day, completely unaware that it was being intercepted, recorded, and would eventually be heard by an entire nation, then printed for anyone to read, then dramatized on television, then resurrected decades later for a whole new generation on social media. The identity of whoever was truly behind the interception of that call and the other royal phone calls recorded around the same period remains one of the unsolved mysteries of that entire chaotic decade for the House of Windsor. Was it really just an unlucky coincidence? An amateur radio enthusiast who happened to catch three separate members of one of the most famous families on Earth on three separate occasions? Or was there something far more deliberate happening behind the scenes? A surveillance operation that someone, for reasons never fully explained, decided to leak to the public at the most damaging possible moment. What we do know for certain is this. A 6-minute phone call, recorded almost by accident on a cold December night in 1989, ended up reshaping the personal lives of two future monarchs, humiliated a man who would one day wear the crown, nearly destroyed the reputation of the woman who would eventually become his queen, and permanently altered the fragile, complicated relationship between Britain's royal family and the press that covers them. More than 3 decades later, people are still talking about it, still listening to old clips of it online, still asking the same questions that were being asked in the House of Commons and on the front pages of British newspapers back in January of 1993. Some secrets, it turns out, don't stay secret forever, and some 6-minute phone calls end up echoing for the rest of a lifetime. There's another layer to this story that often gets lost in the retelling, and it's worth slowing down on because it says a lot about how differently men and women were treated by the press in that era. Charles and Camilla were equally present on that recording. Every word, every laugh, every flirtatious line belonged to both of them equally. And yet, the public narrative that formed around the scandal was almost never balanced. Charles was largely framed as a tragic figure, a man trapped in a loveless arranged marriage, quietly, almost sympathetically, drawn back to his true love. Camilla, on the other hand, was framed as something closer to a villain, a scheming mistress who had supposedly seduced the future king away from his innocent young wife. That framing wasn't fair, and in hindsight, most people, including many journalists who covered the story at the time, have since acknowledged that it wasn't fair, but it stuck. It followed Camilla for years. Newspaper cartoonists drew her as a scheming, almost monstrous figure. She was booed in public. She reportedly couldn't do simple, ordinary things like grocery shopping without being followed, photographed, and shouted at by strangers on the street. Her own children were subjected to intense public scrutiny simply because of who their mother was involved with. It's worth remembering that Camilla, too, was married at the time to a man named Andrew Parker Bowles, and that her own household was thrown into turmoil by the scandal just as thoroughly as the Prince of Wales's was. Her marriage to Parker Bowles would formally end in 1995, 2 years after the tape's contents became public, though, by most accounts, the marriage had already been strained for years by that point, in part because of his own affairs. What made the whole spectacle even stranger was the sheer novelty of it, technologically speaking. In 1989, mobile phones were still a relatively new and clunky luxury, far from the encrypted, secure devices we carry around today. The analog signals those early phones used were, in hindsight, remarkably easy to intercept with the right equipment, which is exactly why hobbyists across Britain had begun buying scanners capable of picking up those signals, sometimes purely out of curiosity, sometimes out of a more mischievous desire to eavesdrop on strangers' conversations. It was, in a sense, one of the earliest and most damaging examples of what we would now instantly recognize as a digital privacy breach, decades before anyone was using terms like data leak or hacked recording in everyday conversation. Royal biographers have since pointed out that the timing of the technology's vulnerability and the timing of the royal family's personal turmoil intersected in almost uniquely disastrous fashion. A decade earlier, the equipment to intercept those calls wouldn't have existed. A decade later, mobile networks had largely moved to digital signals that were far harder for an amateur to casually intercept. Charles and Camilla, and Diana too, were unlucky enough to be having deeply private conversations during the exact narrow window when this kind of casual, almost accidental surveillance was technically possible for ordinary members of the public. It's also worth remembering just how strange the actual content of the call was, beyond the single infamous joke that gave the scandal its lasting nickname. Listening to the full transcript, what strikes most people isn't scandal at all, but a kind of mundane and domesticity. Much of the 6 minutes is actually taken up with the two of them trying to figure out logistics, discussing which of their friends' country houses might be free for them to meet at, debating driving routes and motorway junctions, complaining about how difficult it was to coordinate their schedules around Camilla's husband's shooting, weekends and Charles' own royal engagements. There's a section where they discuss an ambulance workers' strike that was happening in Britain at the time, wondering aloud whether it would affect travel plans. It reads, in long stretches, less like a scandalous affair and more like two overworked, lovesick people trying to find a few stolen hours together in the middle of extremely busy, tightly scheduled lives. That mundane quality is actually part of what made the leak so devastating. It wasn't a single salacious moment taken out of context. It was 6 full minutes of raw, unfiltered intimacy, the kind of conversation nobody would ever want broadcast to the world, precisely because it was so ordinary, so vulnerable, so completely unguarded. There was no performance in it, no royal composure, no careful diplomatic phrasing. It was simply two people, hopelessly in love, missing each other, and it's exactly that rawness that made millions of ordinary Britons feel like they'd witnessed something they had no right to see. The role of the press in all of this deserves scrutiny too, because the newspapers didn't just report on the existence of the tape. They actively amplified the invasion of privacy to an almost unimaginable degree, setting up a telephone hotline that members of the public could call to listen to the actual audio wasn't simply reporting news, it was turning private. Heartbreak into a form of mass entertainment, monetized down to the phone call. It's difficult to overstate how unprecedented that was at the time. Newspapers had published royal gossip for generations, but never before had they essentially created a product out of a private citizen's, even a royal citizen's, most intimate recorded conversation, distributed on demand to anyone willing to dial a number. This is part of why, looking back, so many commentators and even some of the actors who later portrayed Charles and Camilla on screen came to see the scandal less as a story about royal hypocrisy and more as a story about the press overstepping every reasonable boundary of decency. It fundamentally reshaped conversations in Britain about press regulation and personal privacy, conversations that would eventually contribute to major public inquiries into tabloid conduct many years later, following other press scandals involving phone interception that shook British journalism to its core in the following decades. In many ways, the treatment of the Charles and Camilla tape planted an early seed for those much larger, later reckonings about what the press should and shouldn't be allowed to do in pursuit of a story. For the royal family, as an institution, the entire episode also forced an uncomfortable but necessary modernization. Prior to the 1990s, the monarchy had largely operated according to an old, almost Victorian assumption that a certain amount of institutional silence and dignity would protect it from ever having to publicly address personal scandal. Camillagate, arriving practically hand in hand with Diana's own leaked call and the ongoing public collapse of the Wales' marriage, shattered that assumption completely. The palace was forced, awkwardly and slowly, to begin acknowledging, managing, and eventually even explaining personal matters to the public in a way it never had before. Charles' own decision, a year after the scandal, to sit for a lengthy television documentary about his life, during which he directly addressed his infidelity and the state of his marriage, would have been almost unthinkable for a senior royal a generation earlier. Camillagate didn't just embarrass two people. It changed the rules of engagement between the crown and the country it serves. And perhaps that's the most lasting legacy of that 6-minute phone call. More than the punchline, more than the mystery of who recorded it. more than the decades of tabloid mockery that followed. It marked the moment the British monarchy lost the last of its old illusions of untouchable privacy and was forced, kicking and screaming, into a new and far more exposed relationship with the public. It has served for centuries. A relationship where nothing, not even a quiet, tender phone call late on a December night, could ever again be guaranteed to stay truly private. Even now, whenever a new wave of royal drama hits the headlines, whenever a fresh scandal breaks involving a member of the House of Windsor, commentators inevitably reach back to Camilla Gate as the reference point, the moment everything changed. It remains, more than 3 decades later, one of the defining scandals in the modern history of the British monarchy, a story that began with an ordinary man testing out a new radio scanner on an otherwise unremarkable December evening, and ended up reshaping the future of a 1,000-year-old institution.